So let's do the first bit of the first chapter, and we'll see how it goes. So we're going to do security terms and a few security governance principles, and then a lot of it's going to be left for next class. All right. By the way, I don't lecture for 3 hours. I think that would violate the Geneva Convention. I don't know why anybody does that. The idea is that you spend, most of my classes, I only lecture for about an hour and a half, and then I just answer questions. So if you have questions about anything, you can just come to any of my classes or tune in on Twitch any of these nights. Although this class, there's no hands-on stuff, so usually I don't have a lot of those questions. But the hands-on students may well want to come in on Monday night after we get going here, because they're usually the ones that need help, because they can't get the virtual machines running or something. But anyway, all right. So let me see. That's where we are. Here's the stuff that's going to be next time. All right. So security terms. This is actually something I was really pleased when I got my CISSP. I learned the origin of how security was determined. Around in the 60s and 70s, we didn't even know what security was, really. The military had a concept of physical security, and they couldn't figure out how to bring that into the computer world, and we are going to see, as they move through various models, the first thing people understood about security was confidentiality, keeping secrets secret. So they made the Bell La Poudala model we're going to look at, which protects that, and that turned out to have a failure. They had to also consider integrity, so that was the BIBA model, and then they had to consider availability, and this is what the heart of it. It turned out these 3 things are what you need, and this was not obvious. It took about 10 years of different computing security models to figure this out. There are 3 things you need. Confidentiality means that unauthorized people cannot read secret information. Integrity means that unauthorized people cannot modify information. And availability means that authorized people can access the information they should be accessing. And it turns out that you cannot do any of these 3 things perfectly. And that gets me back to the question that came out before, like, is this really going to work to protect you? And the answer is maybe. Because the state of security is when you have enough of these things to get your job done. Like, how secure are we here? I can walk out on the street at night and I probably won't get robbed or shot. Although people are getting robbed and shot in San Francisco, so the safety is not perfect, but there's a degree of security sufficient that people can go to their work and have fun and live. So it's like health. How good is your health? Is there such a thing as perfect health? I don't know, but you never have it. But you have enough health and enough security, you can get the job done. So in the world of computer security, when you have enough security that you can run your business and make a profit and stuff, then you call that a secure enough network. Yeah?
You mean you can't implement you can't guarantee any of these if you implement the others. I can make something completely confidential.
Yes.
I just have to remove all the cables.
Yes,
and
yes.
unplug it.
Yes, exactly. No, what happens is you can only have a certain level of these 3 things for a certain amount of money. If you want more of all 3, you have to pay more money. And if you want more of one, you have to decrease the others typically.
Yes.
So if you want high confidentiality, you have long, complicated passwords and 2-factor authentication. And then what happens is frequently your own employees can't get in because they lost their card or something. So you've decreased availability and so on. And if you want the maximum availability, like in this room, we have computers for students to use. There's no password, no nothing. You can just use them. The only security is the teachers here to notice if you're like stealing them. So that's high availability, no confidentiality, no integrity. Anybody can change them. Now we do have deep freeze on them. So if you reboot them, they'll go back to their default state. So that gives us some integrity, but there's no confidentiality. If you were to put something personal on these machines, there is nothing to stop another student from finding it on there. So and that's what you have. So, all right, so that you call this the CIA triad, and the opposite of confidentiality is disclosure, the opposite of integrity is alteration, and the opposite of availability is destruction. So these are the things you're trying to prevent. So confidentiality keeps data secret, and so theft of PII, like credit card information, or names and addresses and social security numbers, that's a bad thing. You don't want that. If people steal that, you're going to have trouble. HIPAA is the law that requires you to protect medical information on computer networks. And there are many other rules. All right, so data should only be available to users who have clearance, formal access approval, and need to know. This is in a high security military environment. Businesses usually have a simpler situation, but these are possible things you might need. Cleared for that level of information, approval to access this type of data, and a need to know it, or what you often have. Integrity means that nobody's been tampering with the data or modifying it. So this prevents unauthorized people from making modifications and prevents your authorized people from making inappropriate modifications, such as referential integrity. Referential integrity on databases prevents you from making certain mistakes that are obvious. So you have less corruption in the database, and that's maintaining consistency of data that's entered. So you can, to protect your integrity, you have the main control is access controls. For that, you must have authentication. People need to log in. They have to prove that who they are with something like a password. Then you know who they are. Then you have a list of who's allowed to do things. First you authenticate people, and then you limit who has access. Intrusion detection systems detect unauthorized activity on the network. You log the activities on the network, so if there is an intrusion or a breach of a violation of your security policy, you can go back and figure out how big the damage was. This is why you often see people have a breach and they say, well, somebody got one of our passwords and they logged in, but they did not get the credit card information. They say, how do you know that? Well, we have logging. If you don't have logging, then they say, we have no evidence that they stole the credit card information, which is not as good a thing to say. Anyway, so then you maintain your integrity, and encryption and hashing are other ways that can protect integrity. Encryption can also protect confidentiality, but it can't protect integrity in that an attacker will not be able to create the properly encrypted data to corrupt the database. What kind of encryption required for HIPAA? That's a good question. And it is very vague. HIPAA just requires that it is encrypted. It does not specify a technique. So these are vague rules. It's a good question, and there's not a simple satisfactory answer. By the way, there can't be, because encryption keeps changing. The rules keep changing. Everything we trusted is now becoming untrusted because of quantum computing. So really, the rule has to say something like, it must be encrypted, must be protected, things like that. And then exactly what that means in practice will vary. Same thing is true of PCI, the credit card certification. All right, so integrity attacks. Of course, viruses, ransomware, and all those things will corrupt the data. Errors, malicious modifications, people putting backdoors in your system so that they can come in an unauthorized way. All these things are violating the integrity of the data on your servers. And of course, they can all happen. So availability means that when authorized people try to get to the stuff they're supposed to use, they can get it. The server is up, the cables are working, the data is not corrupt, and so on. So to preserve availability, you remove single points of failure. You don't have just one ISP, just one server, just one switch, because when it breaks, you'd lose availability. And you also have to filter traffic to try to prevent denial of service attacks, which are deliberate floods of data trying to overwhelm your system and make them unavailable. So here's threats, things that break, errors, environmental issues, denial of service attacks, and human errors, the number one cause. Most of the time when things go down like Twitter or Facebook or something, and people say they got hacked, most of the time they come back and say, no, we just fouled up. Amazon went down for 4 days, about 8 years ago, and everybody said they'd been hacked, and they said, no, in fact, we were implementing our new high availability system to avoid going down, but we implemented it backwards. So instead of routing all the traffic away from the busy server, it routed all the traffic to the busy server and made it crash more, and it took us 4 days to figure that out. So usually you hack yourself, more often than other people hacking you. Anyway, all right, so availability controls. You have intermediate delivery systems like routers and proxies so that there's another device protecting the server from traffic and having another copy of the data. Access controls can limit who gets in. Redundant systems are the main one. You don't have just one server, you don't have just one network connection. And business continuity planning, we'll talk a lot about that. This is how you plan to survive disasters, like COVID, like an earthquake, like fire, like the building burns down, like you have a serious ransomware outbreak. You have to plan, how are you going to deal with that? That's a management task, and it's a real important one, and that's business continuity. You make a plan to cause your business to survive a disaster. If you don't plan for it, disasters will typically end your business. All right. And they call those fault-tolerant systems. A fault is when something breaks. A failure is when the customers no longer get service. So if your server goes down, but you have another server, that's a fault, but it's not a failure because people continue to get service from the remaining server. That's a fault-tolerant system, where something can break, and yet it continues to provide service to the intended users. All right, so you have to balance these things. You can never have perfect confidentiality, integrity, and availability. You have to decide in your situation how important these various things are, and decide what balance is right for your company. That's why I say this is more like an art than a science. Just like a doctor, you go to the doctor and they have advice, like you should get more exercise, stop drinking and stuff, and how much of that you obey and what part you obey and what part you don't obey. It's a balancing act. It's not like there's a simple right answer. So auditing is measuring things to see if they meet your requirements, typically done for compliance, but it can be done for other reasons. And then accounting is logging what's going on, so you have a log of what happened, and you can, one simple case of accounting is long-distance phone network. Back in the old days, when people used to pay long-distance phone bills, they would log everything so they could know how many minutes you talked to everybody. That the accounting was used to make your bill. And it's the same thing going on here, logging what people are doing on your network. So identification is when you claim to be somebody. Authentication is when you prove it somehow with a fingerprint or a password or something like that. And after that, we now know who you are. Now we can do authorization. Now that we know who you are, we can check the list to see if you're allowed to do whatever you're trying to do. Then auditing records of what you do, and accounting reviews these files to see what people have been doing and see if people have been doing the bad things. Like you'll have to do a high privilege audit to see what your administrators have been doing, because people can create extra administrator accounts and do things, and your systems usually can't see that because they can turn off the network. So you have to do an audit to see what the administrators have been doing periodically, or you're vulnerable to administrators' bad acting. So AAA services are authentication, authorization, and accounting. It's a very common server on any network, and this has been around, like I say, since the old long-distance phone network. That's what they call them. AAA servers kept track of all the phone calls so they could make your phone bill. And in network security, they keep track of the same information for what network activities are happening. All right, and so here, for example, there was a woman that had 8 children, and she was a celebrity, and it turned out at a hospital, 15 workers at the hospital spied on her records to see information about her, and that's highly illegal, and they got fired, and that's because they had good accounting. They were able to go back when this leaked out and say, all right, who looked at her confidential records, and they had a record, so they could fire these people and perhaps prosecute them or something. That's what you want. That's why you need to have it for security, because of course bad things will happen. All right, so now let's do a Kahoot. This is just a optional online quiz, but most people like to do it because it wakes them up. If you get in the top 3 Kahooters, you get 3 points, so it can add up to some points by the end of the semester. And most people, it helps prevent them from falling asleep so much. So 1A is here. All right, so you need a computer or a phone or something. And go to, let's see if I can get this thing, or get ready to join. You go to kahoot.it and put in that number and a name. And there ought to be sound. I hear sound. The all-important sound. There we go. These are multiple choice questions you'll answer on your device, and you're rated for accuracy and speed. So, anyway. A few minutes. Yeah, the window is too wide. All right, we're up to 11 people. Anybody still coming in? Well, I start this one, see how it goes. All right. All right, so Hacker defaces your web page. What has been compromised here? All right, that's integrity. By the way, the question should be echoed to your device, and you'll see that they appear there before they appear on the Twitch stream. The Twitch stream is delayed by a few seconds, so the Twitch people will maybe have to get used to that for the Cahoots. Anyway. All right. So, what does fault tolerant do for you? Yep, that's availability. Good. Popular answer. All right. What does the username do? Yeah, that's identification. It's not authentication. Authentication is proving it with knowledge of a secret like a password. Identification is just claiming to be somebody. Those are two things that are often confused, identification and authentication. All right, if you make errors in data entry, what's gone wrong? Yep, that's a failure of integrity. Good. All right, what's the purpose of an access control list? Yep, that's authorization. Identification is claiming to be somebody, authentication is proving it, and authorization is, now that I know who you are, a list of who's allowed to do what. All right. Here are the winners. You'll have, TOH, you'll have to tell me who you are if you want to get your points. Emmanuel is a real name, though, I think. That might be initials, I don't know. All right, Mike Grader, what's that, get you? Okay, good. All right, well, we ought to take a break. We've been here about an hour. Let's take a 10-minute break. We'll pick up at 7. I'm going to stop the recording.